Welcome to Audio Library. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a truly monumental work. You brought us Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the 1859 publication that, well, it really turned biology upside down, didn't it?
Absolutely did. Before Darwin, the question of life's origins, what he called the mystery of mysteries, was mostly answered by, ideas of fixed, unchanging species, each one specially created.
And Darwin just shattered that. Our plan today is to really get into the nuts and bolts of his argument. How did he build this case? We're going from, farm animals all the way out to the grand sweep of nature.
Exactly. And the crucial thing to grasp right from the start is Darwin's incredible patience. This wasn't some sudden flash of inspiration published overnight. He was methodical.
Right. The Beagle Voyage, that was the catalyst, wasn't it? His trip around the world.
That was definitely the spark. Between 1831 and 1836 on HMS Beagle, especially in South America and the Galapagos, he saw things that just didn't fit the standard view.
Like what specifically? What really struck him?
Two main things, he tells us. First, the way animals and plants were distributed geographically. Finding creatures on islands that were clearly related to those on the nearest mainland, but subtly different, like the mockingbirds on the Galapagos.
Distinct species, but with a family resemblance to South American birds.
Precisely. And second, the geological connection. He was finding fossils of giant extinct animals, like huge armadillos or sloths, right there in the same areas where smaller but clearly related versions were still living.
So it raised the question, if species were fixed, why would extinct forms and living forms in the same place look so similar? And why would island life resemble the nearest continent?
Exactly. These weren't just observations, they were deep questions nagging at him. He started his first notebook on the transmutation of species, as he initially called it, back in 1837.
1837, wow.
And then he wrote a more detailed sketch in 1844. But he didn't publish Origin until 1859. That's over 20 years of accumulating evidence.
20 years? Doing what?
Everything. Collecting facts, reading voraciously, conducting experiments, breeding pigeons, studying barnacles for 8 years solid, talking to farmers, corresponding with naturalists all over the world. He was building an undeniable mountain of evidence.
He wasn't hasty at all.
Anything but.
Right.
He called the 1859 book an abstract. He actually intended something much larger. He was only pushed into publishing when his colleagues, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, warned him that another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, working out in Southeast Asia, had independently arrived at essentially the same core idea, natural selection.
Wallace. Right, so it was kind of a race.
Well, not quite a race in a competitive sense initially. Darwin had the idea much earlier and had developed it far more expensively. But Wallace's papers spurred him to finally publish his abstract alongside Wallace's essay in 1858 before the full book came out. It showed the idea was sort of in the air, but Darwin's version had that incredible weight of evidence behind it.
Okay, so let's dive into that evidence. He starts chapter I, somewhere unexpected perhaps, not with fossils or exotic islands, but with pigeons and sheep. Variation under domestication.
Yes, it's a brilliant strategic move. He starts with the familiar, with things everyone could see for themselves. Domesticated plants and animals.
Why focus there first?
Because it allowed him to establish right away two fundamental points. First, that living things do vary significantly. And second, that humans, through selection, can harness that variation to produce dramatically different forms.
He points out that domestic breeds vary much more than wild species do.
They really do. Think about dogs, a Chihuahua, and a Great Dane. Or all the different kinds of cabbages derived from a single wild ancestor. His point was that domestic organisms are exposed to conditions of life, food, climate, confinement that are not so uniform and often quite different from what their wild ancestors experienced.
And this changing conditions somehow unlocks variation.
That was his strong suspicion. He didn't claim to know the precise laws of variation, which he admitted were complex and poorly understood. But he observed that changing the conditions of life seemed to increase the tendency to vary.
What specific part of the organism did he think was most affected?
He strongly suspected the reproductive system. He noted it's often much more sensitive to environmental changes than other parts of the body.
How so?
Well, think about wild animals in captivity. You might tame them easily, get them used to people, but getting them to breed freely, that's often incredibly difficult. He mentions carnivorous birds, elephants, many animals, they just don't reproduce well, or at all, when taken out of their natural setting.
I see. So the stress or change in conditions directly impacts their ability to reproduce, or maybe the fidelity of reproduction.
Exactly. He suggested that when the reproductive system is disturbed by these changes, it doesn't function quite regularly, and this leads to offspring that aren't perfect copies of their parents. They are variable.
So variation isn't something humans create. It's something inherent that just comes out more under domestication.
Precisely. Humans provide the conditions, and the organism's inherent tendency to vary does the rest. This provides the raw material. And the most spectacular example he uses to demonstrate both the extent of this variation and the power of selection is his work on domestic pigeons.
Yes, the pigeons. He seems almost obsessed.
He was. He joined London pigeon clubs, bred them himself, studied skeletons. He needed a really strong case study. Because, if you look at something like an English carrier pigeon with its long beak and wattles, or a short-faced tumbler, or a pouter pucking out its chest, or a fantail with its huge array of tail feathers.
They look like totally different birds. It's hard to imagine they're related.
That was exactly the point. Most people, especially the expert fanciers, believe these breeds must have descended from multiple distinct wild species, maybe 7 or 8 different original wild pigeons.
But Darwin argued no, they all came from one.
Yes, his conviction was that every single domestic breed, no matter how bizarre, descended from one wild species. The rock pigeon, Columbolivia. A common, unassuming bird you can still see on cliffs and buildings.
Okay, that's a bold claim. How did he possibly prove that to skeptical breeders? What was the killer evidence?
He built the case carefully. First, the sheer improbability of the alternative. If there had been, say, 7 or 8 wild ancestor pigeons, where were they? Why had no one ever found them in the wild? And how likely was it that humans had managed to domesticate and then somehow exterminate all these distinct wild stocks, especially given how hardy the rock pigeon itself is?
Good point. Difficult to imagine wiping out that many wild bird species without a trace.
Second, all these wildly different breeds can be crossed, and their offspring are generally fertile. That's usually a hallmark of varieties with a single species, not distinct species.
Okay, so probability and fertility.
Yeah.
But you said there was a clincher.
There was. The phenomenon of reversion. This was his ace card.
Reversion?
Yeah.
Meaning they go back to looking like the ancestor.
Exactly. He described experiments, some his own, where you take 2 very distinct purebred pigeons, say, a pure white fantail and a pure black barb, breeds that have looked that way for generations. You cross them.
What happened?
The first generation hybrids might be mottled or intermediate, but then, and this is the crucial part, you cross those hybrids together. And in the next generation, among the grandchildren, birds would occasionally appear that looked almost exactly like the original wild rock pigeon.
No way, after generations of artificial breeding.
Yes, they'd suddenly show the characteristic slate blue color, the white rump, the 2 distinct black bars on the wings, the bars on the tail features that hadn't been seen in either the pure fantail or pure barb lineage for ages.
Wow. So the ancestral traits were just hidden, latent somehow.
That's how Darwin interpreted it. The only plausible explanation was that these ancestral traits were still present, genetically speaking, within both breeds, derived from their common ancestor, the rock pigeon. The process of breeding had suppressed them, but the shock of crossing different breeds could cause them to reappear.
That's incredibly powerful evidence for common descent. It blows the multiple ancestors idea out of the water.
It really does. You'd have to make absurd assumptions. Otherwise, all those hypothetical wild ancestors just happen to share those exact markings and the tendency to revert. Reversion strongly pointed to a single origin.
Okay, so variation is real, it's heritable, and it can be profound, as the pigeons show. Now, how do humans use this variation? This brings us to artificial selection.
Right. Darwin saw that humans have been selecting and accumulating variations for millennia, often without even realizing the long-term consequences. He breaks it down into 2 kinds.
The first being?
Methodical selection. This is conscious, deliberate breeding. The breeder has a specific goal, a distinct object in view. They want sheep with finer wool or cows that give more milk, or, as Sir John Seabright famously boasted about pigeons, he could produce any feather pattern he wanted in just 3 years.
So it's goal-oriented, like sculpting a living organism.
Exactly. Darwin quotes agricultural writers like Hewitt calling selection the magician's wand, and Lord Somerville saying breeders acted as if they had chalked out upon a wall a form perfect in itself. This kind of selection can produce big changes relatively quickly because it's so focused.
But Darwin also identified another, perhaps more subtle, but ultimately more powerful form of selection.
Yes, and this is the crucial bridge to understanding nature. He called it Unconscious selection.
Unconscious, meaning people were doing it without realizing it.
Pretty much. Or at least without any intention of permanently altering the breed or creating something fundamentally new. Think about someone who keeps pointers for hunting. Each generation, they might simply keep the dogs that hunt best, that have the best noses or are the fastest, and breed from those. They're not trying to create a new kind of pointer, just preserve the best qualities they currently have.
Or someone saving seed from the hardiest plants in their crop, just for next year's sowing.
Exactly. Or a king favoring a particular type of spaniel. They're not thinking about evolution centuries down the line. They're just making practical, short-term choices. Breed from the best, keep the ones you like most.
But over the long haul.
Over centuries, or millennia, the cumulative effect of everyone tending to preserve the slightly better or slightly preferred individuals leads to immense, gradual modification. He points to the difference between the King Charles Spaniel of his day and those seen in paintings from Charles II's time, or how English racehorses, originally derived from Arab stock, had become significantly larger and faster through generations of selecting the swiftest, even if no single breeder set out to design the modern racehorse.
So it's the slow accumulation of tiny, almost invisible changes.
Yes. He emphasizes the accumulation in one direction of differences absolutely inappreciable by an uneducated eye. It's the slow, steady pressure of consistently favoring slight improvements that, over vast time, creates results just as profound, if not more so, than methodical selection. And that process, he argued, is analogous to what happens in nature.
Okay, that's a powerful analogy. So we've established variation under domestication and the power of human selection, both deliberate and accidental. Now, Darwin needs to show these same principles operate in the wild. Chapter 2. Variation under nature.
Right. He has to demonstrate that variation isn't just an artifact of domestication, but a fundamental property of life everywhere. And this immediately runs into the problem of, well, what is a species?
The species problem. Yeah, that seems like a big hurdle.
It was, and still is in some ways. Back then, naturalists constantly argued about whether certain forms were true species or just well-marked varieties. There was no clear, universally agreed-upon definition that could neatly separate the two.
Why was that distinction so important?
Because the prevailing view tied species to the idea of a distinct act of creation. A species was seen as a fixed, immutable entity. A variety, on the other hand, was seen as a deviation within a species, implying community of descent. So admitting that the line was blurry threatened the whole concept of fixed species.
But Darwin turns this problem on its head, right? He sees the blurriness as evidence for his theory.
Precisely. He argues that this difficulty in distinguishing species from varieties is exactly what you'd expect if species are actually formed through the gradual accumulation of variations. Where you find lots of variation, you'll find forms that are in the process of becoming distinct, what he called incipient species.
So the fuzziness isn't a problem for the theory, it's a prediction of the theory.
Exactly. And he backs this up with data. He looks at large plant collections and finds a telling pattern. Species belonging to larger genera, that is, groups that already contain many distinct species, tend to have, on average, more varieties than species belonging to smaller genera.
Why is that significant?
Because large genera represent places where the manufactory of species, as he put it, has been particularly active and successful in the past. His findings suggest that whatever factors led to the formation of many species in that group are still operating, producing lots of variation, incipient species right now. It's evidence that speciation is an ongoing process, not just something that happened long ago.
Okay, so variation exists in nature, and it's linked to the process of species formation. What drives this process forward? This leads us to Chapter 3 and the core concept of the struggle for existence.
This is absolutely central to the whole theory. Darwin was deeply influenced here by the economist Thomas Malthus.
Malthus and his essay on population.
Yes. Malthus argued that human populations, if unchecked, tend to increase geometrically, doubling every 25 years or so. But resources like food production tend to increase only arithmetically. The inevitable result is a struggle for limited resources.
And Darwin realized this applies even more forcefully to plants and animals.
Infinitely more forcefully. He calculated potential reproductive rates. An elephant, the slowest breeder, could still theoretically produce millions of descendants over centuries. A single codfish produces millions of eggs. A plant might scatter thousands of seeds. Life has this incredible potential for exponential growth.
But the world isn't overrun with elephants or codfish or weeds.
Exactly. Because the vast majority of offspring produced do not survive to reproduce themselves. Every living thing is engaged in a constant battle against the climate, against predators, against disease, and crucially against each other for limited food, water, light, space. This unavoidable competition is the struggle for existence.
He emphasizes that we really need to keep this struggle constantly in mind to understand nature.
Absolutely. He says without it, the whole economy of nature will be dimly seen or quite misunderstood. We see the surface birds singing, flowers blooming, but beneath that is this relentless competition and widespread destruction. Most seeds perish, most young birds don't make it through winter.
And the struggle isn't just direct combat, is it? It's more complex.
Much more complex. It includes dependency. A plant struggling against drought on the edge of a desert is struggling. A plant producing seeds eaten by birds is struggling against them. It's about surviving and critically reproducing in the face of all environmental challenges.
He gives that fascinating example, linking cats, mice, bees, and flowers.
Ah, yes, the clover example. It beautifully illustrates the intricate web of connections. In a particular area, the number of cats might influence the number of field mice.
Because cats eat mice.
Right. And field mice tend to destroy the nests and combs of bumblebees.
Okay.
And bumblebees are the only insects capable of pollinating certain flowers, like red clover, because of the flower's shape and the bee's proboscis length.
So, more cats mean fewer mice, which means more bees, which means more clover.
Precisely. The abundance of a flower could literally depend on the number of cats in the vicinity. It shows how checks and balances in nature can be indirect and surprising.
That's amazing. But he also argues that the fiercest competition isn't always between predator and prey or different kinds of animals.
No, this is case 2. Competition is severest at home. He argues the struggle is almost invariably most severe between the individuals and varieties of the same species.
Why is that?
Because they rely on the exact same resources. They need the same food, live in the same places, face the same dangers. Think about seedlings growing densely together. They're competing for the same light and soil nutrients. Or different varieties of wheat sown together, the ones slightly better adapted to that specific year's climate or soil will outcompete the others, and its descendants will increase while the others diminish.
So your closest relatives are often your toughest competitors.
In many cases, yes. This intense intraspecies competition is a powerful driver.
This seems like it leads naturally to the idea of divergence of character. If competition is fiercest among similar individuals, there must be an advantage to becoming, different.
That's the insight. If everyone is competing for the exact same thing, life is tough. But if some individuals, due to slight variations, can utilize a slightly different resource or live in a slightly different way, they escape the fiercest competition.
Like finches evolving different beak shapes to eat different kinds of seeds on the Galapagos.
That's a classic example, though Darwin focused more on the general principle. Imagine a patch of ground that can support a certain number of grazing animals. It can probably support more animals in total if some graze on grass, some browse on shrubs, and some eat roots, than if they all tried to eat exactly the same blades of grass.
So diversity allows more life to be packed into the same area.
Yes. Variation allows individuals to specialize and occupy different places in the economy of nature, different ecological niches. The more diversified the descendants become in structure, constitution, and habits, the better they can seize on diverse opportunities and the less they compete directly with each other. This tendency for descendants to diverge from their ancestors and from each other is what produces the branching pattern of evolution, the tree of life.
It explains why we don't just see one perfect species, but millions of different forms.
Exactly. Divergence is advantageous. It allows for greater overall success.
He also mentions those really complex ecological interactions, like the fly in Paraguay.
Ah, yes, case 3. Complex ecology. A fascinating case. He reports that in parts of Paraguay, cattle, horses, and dogs simply cannot establish themselves in a feral or wild state.
Even though they thrive wild elsewhere in South America.
Right. The reason apparently was a particular type of fly which was extremely abundant there. These flies would lay their eggs in the navels of newborn animals.
Oh, horrible.
And the resulting infestation was fatal to the young calves, foals, and puppies. So this one tiny insect effectively prevented these large mammals from running wild in that region.
It shows how a single species can have a massive impact on the whole ecosystem structure.
Absolutely. Darwin uses it to illustrate the ever-increasing circles of complexity. If something were to happen to that fly, maybe an increase in insect-eating birds, then cattle and horses might run wild, which would change the vegetation, which would affect other insects, and so on. The web of life is incredibly interconnected.
Okay, so we have variation, we have inheritance, and we have this intense, complex struggle for existence driving competition and divergence. This all sets the stage for Chapter 4 and his core mechanism, natural selection.
Yes, this is the engine of evolution. He formally defines natural selection as the preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations.
Preservation of the good, rejection of the bad. Sounds simple enough.
The principle is simple, but its power is immense. He contrasts it with human efforts. Artificial selection is powerful, but it's often whimsical, focused on superficial traits, and limited by human lifespan and attention. Natural selection, he argues, is a power incessantly ready for action, working silently, day in, day out, across geological time, scrutinizing every tiny variation in structure, constitution, or instinct.
And it's selecting for the organism's own good, not for human utility.
Exactly. It selects traits that give an individual even a slight edge in surviving, finding food, escaping predators, resisting disease, attracting a mate, and ultimately leaving more offspring in its particular environment. He calls it immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts.
Let's use his wolf example to see how it might work in practice.
Okay. Imagine a region where the main prey animal, perhaps deer, becomes faster or more numerous over time.
Right.
In that situation, any wolves that happen to be born slightly swifter or leaner, maybe with longer legs or better endurance, will have a better chance of catching deer compared to their slower packmates.
They'll eat better, be healthier.
Be more likely to survive lean times, and crucially, be more likely to raise successful offspring who might inherit those same traits. Slower wolves might struggle to feed themselves and their pups and leave fewer descendants.
So, over generations, the wolf population in that specific area would tend to become faster and leaner.
Precisely. Natural selection would favor those traits. Darwin actually mentions observations suggesting this happens, citing reports of lighter greyhound-like wolves in the Catskill Mountains that primarily hunted deer, contrasting with heavier, stronger wolves elsewhere that might prey on sheep or other less agile animals. Selection adapts the predator to the available prey and conditions.
It's not creating the variation, just favoring what's already there.
That's the key. Selection acts on the variation that naturally arises.
What about co-adaptation, where two species seem to evolve in response to each other? The nectar example.
Yes, this shows the beautiful subtlety. Consider plants that produce nectar to attract insects for pollination. If some individual plants happen to produce slightly more nectar, or nectar that's slightly more accessible,
They'll attract more insects.
probably. More insect visits mean more efficient cross-pollination, which often leads to more vigorous offspring. So seedlings inheriting the trait for better nectar production would be favored.
And what about the insects?
Well, concurrently, any insects, say bees, that happen to have slightly longer tongues or are slightly better at finding or extracting that nectar will get more food more efficiently.
So they'll thrive and leave more offspring, too, potentially inheriting the better nectar gathering ability.
Exactly. You get this reciprocal evolution. Flowers evolve to attract specific pollinators, and pollinators evolve to efficiently exploit specific flowers. He uses the example of red clover and humblebees again, noting that hive bees generally can't pollinate it because their proboscis is too short. But if humblebees became rare, selection might favor clover variants with shorter tubes, or hive bees with slightly longer tongues. It's a dynamic interplay.
And a consequence of all this selection, this favoring of certain forms, is that other forms must disappear. Extinction.
Extinction is an inevitable part of the process. If new forms are constantly arising, diverging, and becoming better adapted through natural selection, they will tend to increase in numbers and spread.
And since resources are limited,
They will inevitably outcompete and displace the older, less improved, or intermediate parent forms. Rarity, as seen often in the fossil record, is usually the prelude to extinction. As the tree of life grows and branches, many older, lower branches are pruned off. It's a necessary consequence of progress through selection.
okay, so natural selection is the main driving force. But Darwin identified another related force, didn't he? Sexual selection.
Yes, a secondary mechanism, but important for explaining certain kinds of traits. Natural selection deals with survival in the broadest sense, coping with the environment, getting food. Sexual selection deals specifically with reproduction, competing for mates.
How does it differ from natural selection?
The key difference is the outcome of the struggle. In natural selection, the loser often dies or fails to thrive. In sexual selection, the struggle is usually between individuals of the same sex, typically males, for access to the other sex, females. The result for the unsuccessful male is not usually death, but rather few or no offspring.
So it's about reproductive success, specifically through mating advantage.
Exactly. And Darwin saw it working in two main ways.
Which are?
First, through direct battle between males. Think of stags locking antlers, or male seals fighting for control of a harem, or cockerels fighting with their spurs. In these cases, selection favors males that are stronger, better armed, or more vigorous. The winners get to mate and pass on those traits.
Makes sense. What's the second way?
Through charms, or attracting the females. This is particularly evident in birds, where competition is often more peaceful. Males might evolve elaborate plumage. Think of the peacock's tail or the incredible displays of birds of paradise. Or they might evolve complex songs or courtship dances.
And the females choose the most impressive male.
That was Darwin's inference. He argued that the females, over long periods, have consistently preferred males with slightly brighter colors or slightly more elaborate songs or more vigorous displays. This female preference acts as the selective pressure, driving the evolution of these often extravagant male ornaments, even if they might be slightly detrimental to survival, like a huge, cumbersome tail.
So sexual selection explains why males and females of the same species sometimes look so different, even if they live in the same way.
Precisely. When you see striking differences between sexes in color, structure, or ornamentation that aren't related to different roles in, say, caring for young, sexual selection is often the explanation. It's why the male bird might be brilliantly colored while the female is camouflaged. The male needs to attract a mate. The female needs to survive and protect the nest.
Okay, that covers the main mechanisms. But Darwin knew his theory would face challenges. He dedicated chapters to addressing the difficulties on theory. Let's talk about instincts. That seems like a tough one for gradual evolution.
It certainly was, and is. Instincts often appear so complex, so perfect, so innate, it's hard to imagine them arising step by step. Darwin himself called the instinct of the hive bee to make its hexagonal cells one of the most wonderful of all known instincts.
The honeycomb structure. It's incredibly precise, mathematically efficient for using wax and space. How could that possibly evolve gradually? A slightly imperfect cell seems useless.
Darwin tackled this head-on, using his principle of gradation. He argued that even this seemingly perfect instinct could be reached through a series of small, advantageous steps preserved by natural selection.
What was the proposed sequence?
He started with simpler related bees. Humblebees, for instance, make rough, somewhat irregular, rounded wax cells clustered together. Not very efficient.
Okay, a basic starting point.
Then he looked at a Mexican bee species, Melipona domestica. These bees build cells that are roughly spherical, but they build them very close together. Where the spheres touch, the bees build flat walls of wax between them, apparently to save material.
Ah, so they're already modifying the spheres where they intersect.
Yes, and because of the geometry of packing spheres, where three cells meet at the base, these intersecting flat walls naturally form a shallow three-sided pyramid, a sort of gross imitation, as Darwin put it, of the hive bee's perfect three-sided pyramidal base.
So the Melipona shows an intermediate stage driven by wax economy.
Exactly. It demonstrates a plausible intermediate step. From there, he argued, selection could favor bees that made the intersecting walls even flatter, the angles more precise, gradually approaching the perfect hexagonal prism with the pyramidal base, because any slight improvement that saved wax would be a huge advantage.
Why is saving wax so important?
Because producing wax is incredibly costly for bees. Darwin cites experiments suggesting it takes something like 12 to 15 pounds of sugar or nectar consumed to produce just 1 pound of wax. Honey saved is energy saved, which means a more successful colony. So any instinctual variation that led to even slightly more efficient cell construction would be strongly favored by natural selection.
That's a compelling argument from gradation. Okay, what about an even trickier problem? The neuter insects, worker ants or bees that are sterile.
Yes. Darwin himself admitted this was by far the most serious special difficulty his theory faced.
Why was it so difficult?
Because you have these worker castes, ants, for example, where individuals are sterile, they don't reproduce. Yet they often have structures and instincts dramatically different from their fertile parents, the queen and males. Think of soldier ants with huge jaws, or tiny worker ants, or ants that make slaves.
Right. If they're sterile, they can't pass on their unique traits. So how could natural selection possibly create those traits?
Yeah.
It seems to break the chain of inheritance.
It does seem to at first glance. How can selection favor a trait in an individual that never has offspring?
What was Darwin's solution?
It was ingenious. He argued that selection acts not on the sterile individual worker, but on the family or the colony, specifically through the fertile parents, the queen and males.
How does that work?
Imagine an ant queen that happens to produce a batch of sterile workers who are slightly better at foraging or defending the nest or building the hive. That entire colony will be more successful than a neighboring colony with less efficient workers.
Okay, a more successful colony means.
It will likely produce more fertile offspring, new queens and males, in the next generation. And those new queens and males will inherit dependency from their mother to produce similarly advantageous sterile workers.
Ah. So selection favors the parents who produce the best workers, even though the workers themselves don't reproduce.
Precisely. The unit of selection effectively becomes the colony, mediated through the reproductive success of the fertile members. The specialized structures of the workers, like different jaw sizes or even rudimentary eyes in smaller workers as seen in some ant species, are traits linked to sterility, developed because they benefited the whole family's survival and reproduction.
That's clever, shifting the level of selection. Okay, another big challenge area, hybrid sterility. The fact that different species, when crossed, often produce sterile offspring like a mule. Wasn't this seen as proof that species were fundamentally distinct, created barriers?
Yes, the sterility of hybrids was widely considered one of the strongest arguments for the fixity of species. It seemed like a natural mechanism designed to keep species separate and pure.
How did Darwin counter this? He couldn't deny that hybrids are often sterile.
He didn't deny it, but he attacked the idea that sterility was a sharp, absolute dividing line, or that was a specially endowed quality. He leaned heavily on the extensive experimental work of hybridizers like Kohlreuter and Gertner.
What did their work show?
It showed that sterility isn't an all-or-nothing thing. It exists in all possible degrees. Some species crosses produce offspring that are perfectly fertile. Others produce offspring with slightly reduced fertility. Others are highly sterile, and some crosses fail to produce offspring at all. Gertner, Darwin notes, had to painstakingly count seeds sometimes just to detect a slight difference in fertility between a hybrid and its parents.
So it's a gradient, not a hard barrier.
Exactly. It graduates away so insensibly, Darwin wrote. Furthermore, the results were often inconsistent. Kohlreuter and Gertner sometimes reached diametrically opposite conclusions about the fertility of the same crosses, and sometimes crosses between forms that botanists generally considered mere varieties proved very difficult or resulted in sterile offspring.
Varieties being sterile, like the primrose and cowslip example.
Yes, Gertner found it surprisingly difficult to get fertile hybrids between the common primrose and cowslip, which most botanists ranked as varieties. He even found that certain acknowledged varieties, like different color forms of the pimpernel, could be absolutely sterile when crossed.
So if varieties can be sterile when crossed, sterility can't be the definitive test of a species.
That was Darwin's point. If the supposed barrier exists within species sometimes, it can't be the thing that defines species.
Did he offer an alternative explanation for why crossing different forms often leads to sterility?
He did. He drew a powerful analogy. He pointed out that the reproductive systems of organisms are often exquisitely sensitive to any change in conditions. We already discussed how wild animals often fail to breed in captivity, even when they're perfectly healthy otherwise.
Right. Confinement or unnatural conditions disrupt reproduction.
So, Darwin argued, the sterility that arises from crossing two distinct species, which have evolved different reproductive systems over time, is not some special barrier, but is closely analogous to the sterility that arises when a pure species is simply placed in unnatural conditions. In both cases, the delicate reproductive system is disturbed, leading to failure. It's a byproduct of divergence, not a specific adaptation to prevent mixing.
That reframes it completely. Okay, let's shift gears from the mechanisms and difficulties to the broader patterns Darwin used as evidence. Part 4, morphology, embryology, geography. Starting with morphology.
Morphology, the study of form and structure, Darwin considered this incredibly important, the very soul of natural history. The key concept here is homology, or unity of type.
Unity of type, meaning shared basic designs.
Yes. The puzzle is why very different organisms living in very different ways often seem to be built on the same fundamental blueprint.
The classic example being the vertebrate limb.
Absolutely. Think about it. The arm and hand of a human, used for grasping. The front leg of a horse, modified for running. The flipper of a whale or porpoise for swimming. The wing of a bat for flying. even the digging forelimb of a mole.
They're all used for completely different things.
Totally different functions. Yet, if you look at the underlying skeleton, you find the same basic arrangement of bones. One bone in the upper arm, humerus, two bones in the forearm, radius and ulna, a set of wrist bones, carpals, and then the hand-paw flippering bones, metacarpals and flanges.
The same pattern, just stretched, shortened, flattened, or fused in different ways.
Precisely. Or look at insect mouthparts. The complex sucking proboscis of a butterfly, the piercing stylets of a mosquito, the chewing mandibles of a beetle. Comparative anatomy shows they are all constructed from modifications of the same fundamental set of ancestral parts.
Why is this significant for Darwin's theory?
Because under the traditional view of separate creation for each species, tailored perfectly to its needs, this makes no sense. Why use the same limited set of bones for flying, swimming, running, and grasping? It seems inefficient.
But under descent with modification.
It's exactly what you'd predict. The underlying similarity, the homology, is the inheritance from a common ancestor that possessed that basic limb structure. Natural selection then modified that ancestral structure for different purposes in different descendant lineages. Bones became longer or shorter, fused or reduced. But the fundamental pattern, the unity of type, betrays the shared ancestry. Selection modifies what's already there. It rarely conjures up entirely new designs from scratch.
So homology is evidence of inheritance. What about embryology, the study of development?
Another powerful line of evidence. Darwin was fascinated by the fact that the embryos of very different animals within the same broad group often look remarkably similar in their early stages.
Like the famous observation by Agassiz.
Yes. The great naturalist Louis Agassiz noted that if you showed him an early vertebrate embryo without a label, he often couldn't tell if it was going to become a fish, a reptile, a bird, or a mammal. They share common features early on.
Such as?
Things like gill slits or structures remarkably similar to gill slits appearing on the side of the neck in the embryos of mammals, birds, and reptiles, even though these animals breathe air and never develop functional gills. Or the way major arteries loop near these slits, similar to the pattern in fish.
Why would a land animal embryo briefly develop fish-like structures?
Darwin's explanation was that these embryonic similarities reflect the structure of a distant, ancient, common ancestor. Variations and adaptations tend to appear later in development, closer to the age when the animal has to fend for itself.
So adaptations get tacked on later in life and are inherited at that later age.
Generally, yes. This means the early embryonic stages are often less modified and remain more similar to the ancestral condition. The embryo, Darwin said, gives us a picture, preserved by nature, of the ancient and less modified condition of each animal.
It's like looking back in evolutionary time during development.
In a way, yes. And this also explains rudimentary organs, those strange, shrunken, often useless parts found in many organisms.
Vestigial structures.
Like the tiny, useless leg bones buried inside the body of some snakes and whales, or the teeth that develop in the jaws of embryonic baleen whales but are later absorbed and never cut through the gums, or the teeth in the upper jaws of unborn calves that also never erupt, or the minuscule wings hidden beneath the fused wing covers of beetles that live on windswept islands and never fly.
These seem like direct contradictions to the idea of perfect creation for a purpose.
Absolutely. Why would a creator install useless teeth or wings?
Yeah.
Darwin argued these structures bear the plain stamp of inutility under the creation view. But under descent with modification, the explanation is simple and elegant.
They are leftovers.
Exactly. They are remnants inherited from ancestors in whom the organ was fully developed and functional. As descendants adapted to new ways of life where the organ was no longer needed, like snakes losing legs or island beetles losing flight, the organ gradually diminished through disuse or selection against it, but hasn't been eliminated entirely. It's a historical marker, anatomical baggage.
Okay, morphology and embryology point to shared history. What about the geographical distribution of species? Biogeography.
This was perhaps the evidence that struck Darwin most forcefully on the Beagle voyage. He saw clear patterns in where species lived and where they didn't.
The importance of barriers, for instance.
Yes. Huge oceans, vast deserts, high mountain ranges often mark sharp boundaries between different sets of plants and animals, even if the climate on either side is very similar. Yeah. South America and Africa have similar tropical climates, but their native mammals and birds are fundamentally different.
What did this suggest to him?
It strongly suggested that species originated in one place, a single center of creation, and spread out from there, but were blocked by major barriers. If species were created independently in every suitable location, you'd expect similar climates to have similar life forms, regardless of barriers. But that's not what we see.
But then how do you explain species found in very distant places, like on remote oceanic islands? They must have crossed barriers somehow.
Right. The theory requires mechanisms for occasional long-distance dispersal. Darwin devoted a lot of effort to demonstrating that this wasn't impossible.
How could seeds travel across oceans?
He did experiments. He soaked seeds of various plants in salt water for weeks to see if they could survive a long sea journey. Many could. He found seeds embedded in dried mud on the feet of birds, suggesting birds could carry seeds vast distances. He calculated that seeds could travel inside the floating carcasses of birds or attached to driftwood.
The mud on birds' feet example is amazing.
It really is. He collected just a few tablespoons of dried mud from the edge of a pond, kept it moist under glass, and documented hundreds of seedlings sprouting over months from seeds that must have been dormant in that tiny sample of mud. It showed the incredible potential for dispersal by birds carrying mud.
So accidental transport can explain how remote islands get colonized.
Yeah.
What about patterns across continents, like similar species in northern Europe and North America?
That requires invoking climate change, specifically the glacial period, the ice ages.
How does the Ice Age explain current distributions?
Darwin argued that during colder glacial periods, Arctic and temperate species would have been driven southwards in both the Old World and the New World. This would have allowed species that previously lived only in the far north to spread across areas that are now temperate.
Okay.
Then, as the climate warmed up again and the glaciers retreated, these cold-adapted species would have retreated northwards and upwards in elevation onto mountain ranges.
So the same species, or closely related ones, could end up isolated in the Arctic and on mountaintops far to the south.
Exactly. This explains the puzzling phenomenon of alpine flora, identical or very similar plants found on widely separated mountain summits, like the Alps and the Scottish Highlands or mountains in North America, and also in the Arctic Circle, but absent from the intervening lowlands. They are remnants of a once continuous distribution during colder times, now isolated by warmer climates.
It connects geology, climate, and distribution. Very elegant. And finally, back to the islands, the Galapagos.
The Galapagos were Darwin's ultimate case study in biogeography. These volcanic islands are relatively young, hundreds of miles off the coast of South America.
What was so special about their inhabitants?
Two key things. First, the animals and plants, while unique, bore the unmistakable stamp of the South American continent. The finches, the tortoises, the mockingbirds, the plants, they were clearly related most closely to South American forms, not Asian or African forms.
Suggesting their ancestors came from South America.
Precisely. Second, most of the species found on the Galapagos were endemic, found nowhere else in the world. And often, different islands within the archipelago had their own distinct species or varieties of, say, finches or tortoises.
So colonists arrived from the mainland and then diversified on the islands.
That was the inescapable conclusion for Darwin. It was inexplicable, he said, on the view of separate creation, why create unique species on these barren volcanic islands that just happened to resemble those on the nearest continent. But it made perfect sense under descent with modification. Colonists arrive, they are isolated, they adapt to the specific conditions of their island, or different parts of the same island, and through natural selection and divergence, they become new species, while still retaining the hallmark of their ancestral origin. The same pattern held for the Cape Verde Islands near Africa. Their unique inhabitants were related to African forms.
Okay, so bringing it all together now in part 5. Darwin has laid out variation, the struggle, natural selection, divergence, and then shown how this explains patterns in morphology, embryology, and geography.
Exactly. He recapitulates the argument. We see variation everywhere. Life's tendency to increase geometrically leads to a struggle. This struggle allows natural selection to preserve favorable variations and eliminate unfavorable ones. Over vast geological time, this process causes divergence of character, leading to the formation of new species and the extinction of older ones.
And the evidence from different fields all converges on one explanation.
Yes. The hierarchical classification of life, species within genera, genera within families, isn't arbitrary. It reflects the branching pattern of descent from common ancestors. It's a genealogy. The homologous structures, the embryonic similarities, the rudimentary organs, the geographical distribution patterns, they all make sense if life shares common ancestry and has been modified over time. No other theory, he argued, could explain all these disparate facts so coherently.
It's a truly unifying theory. So let's end with that provocative thought Darwin leaves us with. He challenges the idea of perfection in nature.
Right. We tend to think of natural selection as producing perfect adaptations. But Darwin cautions against this. Natural selection works only for the good of each being in relation to its conditions of life. It's about relative advantage, not absolute perfection.
Meaning adaptations are often compromises or just good enough.
Precisely. Things don't have to be perfectly designed in some abstract sense. They just need to be slightly better than the competition. He points out that even the human eye, often cited as an example of perfect design, isn't perfectly corrected for optical aberrations, according to experts like Helmholtz.
So we should look for the imperfections, the trade-offs, as evidence supporting the theory.
Exactly. Think about the sting of a bee.
Yes.
When a honeybee stings certain enemies, especially mammals with thick skin, the barbs on the sting cause it to embed firmly. When the bee tries to pull away, it rips out part of its own abdomen, leading to its death.
That doesn't sound very perfect for the bee itself.
Not at all. A perfect weapon wouldn't kill the user. But if having that barbed sting provides a significant advantage on the whole for defending the colony, perhaps it's more effective against insect enemies or the self-sacrifice deters larger predators, then natural selection could favor it, despite the fatal drawback for the individual in certain situations. It's a compromise.
What about the apparent wastefulness in nature?
Another sign of optimization rather than perfect design. Think of pine trees releasing enormous clouds of pollen, the vast majority of which just falls to the ground wasted, just so a tiny fraction might reach a female cone by chance. Or the hive bee producing hundreds, even thousands, of male drones, most of whom never mate and are eventually killed or driven out by the workers.
Seems inefficient if you were designing it from scratch.
It does. Darwin calls these things abhorrent to our ideas of fitness, if viewed as perfect designs. But they make sense as evolutionary outcomes. Maybe producing excess pollen is simply the most reliable way to ensure some fertilization occurs via wind. Maybe producing many drones ensures the queen gets mated quickly and effectively, even if most drones are redundant. These are strategies that worked well enough to be preserved, even if they seem wasteful to us.
So the challenge for us when looking at the natural world is not just to admire the adaptations, but also to notice the quirks, the flaws, the historical baggage, the trade-offs.
Exactly. Because those imperfections are often the strongest clues telling us that life wasn't immaculately designed, but rather cobbled together over eons through the messy, opportunistic, yet incredibly powerful process of descent, with modification driven by natural selection.
What other imperfections, what trade-offs can you spot in the world around you that whisper evolution rather than perfect design? That's a fantastic question to ponder. Thank you for guiding us through Darwin's foundational arguments today.
It's been a pleasure. It's a book that still rewards deep reading.